My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old, and after losing my job in Seattle, I decided to move back to my hometown in rural Montana. Housing prices in the city had skyrocketed, and I couldn't afford to stay there on unemployment. My aunt had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving her farmhouse to my father, who had no interest in it. He offered to let me live there rent-free while I figured out my next steps. The property sat on 40 acres of land, about 15 minutes outside the nearest town, which was little more than a post office, a gas station, and a diner. The house itself was modest but sturdy. A 2-bedroom farmhouse built in the 1950s, with a large kitchen and a wraparound porch. It was isolated, with the nearest neighbor almost a mile down the road. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the place, applying for remote jobs, and enjoying the quiet. The nights were startlingly dark compared to the city, but I adjusted quickly. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset while nursing a beer, listening to the crickets and distant coyote calls. About a month after moving in, I noticed something odd while walking the property line. There was a section of fence at the far north end of the property that had been recently repaired. The fence posts were newer than the others, and the wire was shiny and unrusted. I hadn't done this work myself, and as far as I knew, my aunt had been too frail to manage fence repairs in her final years. I asked my father about it on our weekly call, but he had no idea who might have fixed the fence. He suggested it might have been a neighboring rancher, since good fences prevent livestock disputes. That explanation made sense, so I didn't think much more about it. A week later, I spotted something hanging from one of the new fence posts, a small burlap bag. Curious, I walked over to investigate. Inside the bag were 3 dead rabbits, freshly killed, their necks broken. I assumed some local hunter had left them there, perhaps as an offering or payment for using my land as a shortcut. It seemed strange, but rural customs can be odd to outsiders, even former locals like me who had been away for years. I buried the rabbits and thought nothing more about it until 3 days later, when I found another bag in the same spot. This time, it contained a single fox, its red fur matted with blood. This was more disturbing. I decided to investigate the neighboring properties to see who might be leaving these gifts. The closest neighbor to the north was an old cattle ranch owned by the Peterson family. I'd never met them, as they kept to themselves, but my aunt had mentioned them occasionally. I drove over one afternoon and found Mr. Peterson working in his yard. He was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with calloused hands and a permanent squint from years in the sun. I asked about the fence and the dead animals. In a thick accent, he replied and claimed no knowledge of either and seemed genuinely confused. As I turned to leave, he mentioned that the land between our properties had been disputed generations ago. There had been some trouble with the original boundary lines, but it had been settled legally decades back. That night, it was just after midnight, when a metallic scraping sound woke me from a dead sleep. It seemed to be coming from the back porch. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept downstairs. The sound stopped just as I reached the kitchen door. When I turned on the porch light and looked outside, I saw nothing unusual except the porch swing moving slightly in the breeze. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the back door, just below the handle, as if someone had tried to pry it open. I called the county sheriff's office, and a deputy named Carlson came by that afternoon. He was young and didn't have a lot of experience. He suggested it could have been a bear or mountain lion, though neither had been spotted in the area recently. He recommended I install motion sensor lights and keep my doors locked. I installed the lights that same day, along with a basic security camera system that uploaded to the cloud. That night, I slept poorly, waking at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. Around 2:15 a.m., the motion lights flashed on. I grabbed my phone to check the camera feed and saw a figure standing at the edge of my yard, just at the tree line. They were wearing dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. They stood perfectly still, just staring at the house for nearly 10 minutes before turning and walking into the trees. I called Deputy Carlson again the next morning. He reviewed the footage, but said there wasn't much he could do about someone standing on the edge of my property in the middle of the night. He suggested it might be a trespasser or poacher using my land. As he was leaving, he mentioned that he read my aunt's file, and found that she had made similar calls during her last few years, reporting someone prowling around the property at night. This information chilled me. I hadn't known my aunt well. She was my father's sister and somewhat estranged from the family. But I couldn't imagine why anyone would harass an elderly woman living alone. I called my father and asked if he knew anything about trouble my aunt might have had. After a long pause, he admitted that she had become paranoid in her final years, claiming someone was trying to drive her off the land. The family had attributed it to her declining health and isolation. Over the next week, the nighttime visitor returned twice more, always standing just at the edge of the camera's range. Each time, they would arrive around 2 a.m. and simply watch the house. I began to sleep with a hunting rifle leaning against my bedside table, though I wasn't sure I could actually use it if confronted. Then the fence line gifts escalated. I found a gutted deer hanging from the fence post, its blood soaking into the ground below. The sight made me physically ill. This was no longer something I could dismiss as a strange local custom. I decided to stake out the fence line. I set up a blind in the trees about 50 yards from the repaired section and waited through the night with my binoculars and rifle. Nothing happened the first night, nor the second. On the third night, just as I was about to give up around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps approaching through the trees from the north. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, carrying something bulky over one shoulder. In the moonlight, I could make out the same wide-brimmed hat from the security footage. The figure moved to the fence post and began to hang what looked like another animal carcass. I stepped out from my hiding place, rifle raised, and called for them to stop. The figure froze, then slowly turned toward me. I couldn't make out their face in the darkness, but I felt their gaze lock onto mine. Without a word, they dropped whatever they were carrying and moved toward me with startling speed. I fired a warning shot into the air, which momentarily stopped their advance. They stood still for a beat, then calmly stated that this land had never belonged to my family, that we were trespassers who had stolen it through false deeds and corrupt courts, that it would return to its rightful owners. The voice was deep and steady, belonging to an older man, but the accent was different to the one of Mr. Peterson I spoke to some days ago. Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the trees with surprising agility for his apparent age. I was too shocked to follow. The next day, I drove to the county records office and requested the history of my aunt's property. The documents showed that the land had indeed been involved in a boundary dispute in the 1940s between my family and that of the Peterson family. The courts had ruled in my family's favor, granting us the additional 15 acres that had been contested. According to the notes, the case had been bitter, with accusations of forged documents on both sides. I spoke with a local historian who explained that the disputed land contained the only year-round spring in the area, making it extremely valuable to both properties. The Peterson family had maintained for generations that the final judgment was the result of bribes and corruption. When I returned to the property that evening, I found all my security cameras smashed and a note nailed to the front door. It contained just 3 words: "Leave or else." I packed up that night and drove to a motel in town. The next morning, I called a realtor and listed the property for sale, disclosing the ongoing dispute and harassment. The house sat on the market for months before finally selling for well below market value to a development company that planned to divide it into smaller parcels. I moved to Bozeman and found work at a local tech company. Sometimes I think about calling the new owners to warn them, but I never do. I tell myself the problem probably died with the old property lines being erased by the new development. I never found out who the man was by the fence that night, but I've convinced myself it must be a family member of the Peterson family. I was 14 last summer when I spent 2 months at my grandmother's farm in the foothills of the Appalachians. City folk find it strange how we live out there. No neighbors for miles, spotty cell service at best, and kids given the kind of freedom that would make urban parents faint. The surrounding woods and fields belong to just 3 families, including ours, spanning generations of farming the same land. Grandmother's property stretched nearly 200 acres, mostly wilderness with patches of cultivated land. I knew every creek, hill, and hollow from summers spent roaming wild with my cousin Beth, who lived just over the ridge. Beth and I had planned to do some wildflower photographing for her science project this summer. It had been unusually wet that year, and different species were blooming everywhere. We needed specific varieties that supposedly grew near the old quarry, about 4 miles from the farmhouse. Grandmother had always warned us about the quarry, not because of the steep drops or deep water, though those were dangerous too, but because the old access road attracted the wrong sort of people. I never questioned what she meant until that day. We set out early, carrying our backpacks with water bottles, sandwiches, and Beth's camera equipment. The humidity was suffocating, making our shirts cling to our backs within minutes. The forest canopy provided some relief, dappled sunlight filtering through as we followed the overgrown logging trail. After about 3 miles, we reached the fork where the quarry road branched off. I noticed Beth hesitate, suddenly feeling unease. She suggested turning back, mentioning something about her mother expecting us for lunch, though we both knew that wasn't true. I insisted we continue, reminding her about the rare blue-petaled wildflower she needed for her collection. We walked another 15 minutes before spotting an old truck parked at the edge of the clearing. It was rusted in patches, but clearly still running. Empty beer cans littered the ground nearby. Beth grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in as she nodded toward movement near the quarry's edge. 2 men stood about 50 yards away, their backs to us. Something about them immediately put me on edge. Not just that they were strangers in a place where strangers never ventured, but something in their posture as they surveyed the quarry below. One was tall and lanky, the other shorter, but muscular. Both wore dirty work clothes despite the heat. We should have turned around immediately. Instead, I suggested we circle through the woods to reach the flower patch on the far side. Beth reluctantly agreed, though I could sense her unease growing as we picked our way through the underbrush. We'd almost reached our destination when the men's voices carried to us across the clearing. They were discussing something about the depth of the water and how long it would take something to dissolve. One mentioned concrete blocks and chains. The taller one laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Beth froze beside me, her face draining of color. She mouthed that we needed to leave. Now. I nodded, suddenly understanding the gravity of what we might have stumbled upon. We began carefully backing away, moving as silently as possible through the dense undergrowth. A branch snapped beneath my foot with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire forest. The men went silent. We heard one ask who was there, his tone shifting from casual to threatening. The shorter one suggested checking the woods, mentioning he'd thought he heard something earlier too. Beth grabbed my hand and we bolted, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Crashing through the underbrush, we ran parallel to the main trail rather than toward it, fearing the men would expect us to take the obvious route. I could hear them shouting behind us, their voices growing more distant than closer as they searched. The shorter man called out, his voice deceptively friendly, asking if we were lost kids who needed help finding our way back. The taller man took a different approach, threatening what would happen if they caught us spying. Their footsteps crashed through the forest somewhere to our right. Beth pulled me down behind a fallen tree as the men passed just 20 yards away. We lay there, hardly daring to breathe, as twigs snapped under their boots. I swear to God, to this day I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was at that moment. The taller man suggested splitting up to cover more ground, confident they could outrun a couple of kids. He mentioned checking the main trail, thinking we'd head for the road. When they moved far enough away, Beth whispered that we should follow the creek bed. It would take longer, but would lead us back to the property line without leaving obvious tracks. We slid down the embankment, our shoes sinking into the cold mud as we waded through ankle-deep water. For nearly an hour, we sloshed downstream, constantly glancing over our shoulders. Every bird call made us freeze, every distant sound tensed our muscles for flight. The creek eventually widened as it approached grandmother's property. Just as I began to think we were safe, voices echoed from somewhere upstream. Beth yanked me into a dense thicket of blackberry bushes. The thorns tore at our skin, but we pushed deeper, making ourselves as small as possible. Through the leaves, we glimpsed the men following our trail along the creek. The taller man held something that glinted in the sunlight, which now thinking back had to have been a firearm. They passed within 10 feet of our hiding spot. I could see sweat staining the shorter man's shirt and could smell the cigarette he was puffing on. Luckily, neither of them noticed us and walked right by. We remained motionless until long after their voices faded. When we finally emerged, scratched and bleeding from the thorns, the sun was starting to set. We abandoned caution for speed, running the final mile to grandmother's farm. Only when we reached the front porch did I finally feel a sense of security. We told my grandmother the whole story and she immediately called the sheriff, whom we told everything we had seen. We were later informed that law enforcement found evidence of multiple shallow graves at the quarry. The men were never caught, having abandoned their truck and disappeared into the network of back roads that crisscrossed the mountains. Years later, I returned to my grandmother's farm with my husband James. The wildflowers still bloom near the quarry, though neither of us has ever ventured back there. When our daughter asks to explore the woods alone, I tell her she must always stay within sight of the farmhouse. City folks might call me overprotective, but they don't understand what lurks in the beautiful wilderness of the countryside, where a person can disappear without a trace. My name is Adam. The majority of my childhood summers were spent at my Aunt Jenna's farmhouse in Wyoming. My parents would drop me off there every June when school ended so they could focus on their restaurant business during the tourist season in Portland. The year I turned 9 was no different, except this time my cousin Ellie would be joining me. She lived with her dad in California, but he was going overseas for work that summer. The drive to my aunt's place was long and winding. We passed through towns that grew smaller and farther apart until we reached the dirt road that led to her property. The farmhouse was beautiful in a weathered way, sitting alone against a backdrop of golden fields and dense woods. A large barn stood about 50 yards from the house, and beyond that was a creek that cut through the property. Ellie and I shared the upstairs bedroom with 2 twin beds and a window that faced the woods. The first few days were filled with exploring the property, helping Aunt Jenna tend to her garden, and playing with her aging dog, Max. Aunt Jenna worked from home as a graphic designer, so during the day, she would be downstairs in her office while Ellie and I entertained ourselves. On our 5th night there, I woke up to the sound of tapping on our bedroom window. It was subtle at first, almost like a tree branch hitting the glass, but there were no trees close enough to the house for that. The tapping continued, becoming more deliberate. I was frozen in my bed, too afraid to look. Ellie slept soundly in the bed across from mine, unaware of the noise. I eventually mustered up enough courage to wake Aunt Jenna. She came upstairs with her flashlight and checked outside the window, but found nothing. She suggested it might have been a bird confused by its reflection, or perhaps just the house settling. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. The next day, Ellie and I were playing near the creek when Max started barking aggressively at something in the woods. We both turned to look and saw a figure standing between the trees. It was a man wearing blue overalls with a beard and long hair. He didn't move or speak, just watched us from a distance. We immediately ran back to the house to tell Aunt Jenna, but when she came outside to look, the man was gone. Aunt Jenna called the local sheriff to report what we'd seen. When he arrived, he searched the area but found nothing except for some footprints by the creek. He told Aunt Jenna it was probably just a hiker who had strayed from the public trail that ran about a mile from her property. He promised to increase patrols in the area, but we could tell he wasn't too concerned. That night, Aunt Jenna locked all the doors and windows before we went to bed. I was still uneasy and had trouble falling asleep. Around midnight, I heard whistling outside. It was a familiar tune, the theme song from a cartoon show that Ellie and I had been watching earlier that day. I shook Ellie awake this time, and we both listened as the whistling continued just below our window. Suddenly, the whistling stopped and was replaced by a voice claiming to be Aunt Jenna, telling us to come downstairs because she had made a late-night snack. But something about the voice didn't sound right. It was slightly deeper than Aunt Jenna's. Ellie started to get out of bed, but I grabbed her arm and whispered that we should check if Aunt Jenna was actually in her room first. We crept quietly to Aunt Jenna's bedroom and found her sound asleep. When we woke her and told her what we'd heard, her face went pale. She immediately called the sheriff again and then took us to her bedroom, locking the door behind us. We all sat on her bed with Max at our feet, listening intently for any sounds. About 20 minutes later, we heard the front door handle turning. Someone was trying to get in. Aunt Jenna clutched us closer as Max began to growl. Then came the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen. Max barked loudly and pounded against the bedroom door. Now I don't know why, but for some reason I cannot explain. Aunt Jenna made the decision to unlock the door and let Max out. As soon as she opened the door, Max bolted out, and we heard a commotion downstairs. A man's shout, things being knocked over, and Max's continued barking. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies just as Max's barking turned to whimpering. They found a man in the kitchen, wielding a hunting knife. Max had bitten him on the leg, which had slowed him down. The man was apprehended, and Max was injured but would recover. The intruder was identified as a guy named Thomas, a former employee at my parents' restaurant who had been fired 6 months earlier for stealing. He had apparently been watching our family for some time and knew about the summer arrangement. He had followed us to Wyoming, camping in the woods near Aunt Jenna's property while plotting his revenge. His plan had been to take me as a way to get back at my parents, using me to extort money from them. In his backpack, they found rope, duct tape, and a detailed map of Aunt Jenna's property. He had been observing our routines for days and knew when we went to bed each night. My parents arrived the next day, having driven through the night after hearing what happened. They decided that Ellie and I would return to Portland with them immediately. They had already made arrangements to hire managers for the restaurant so they could spend more time with me. Aunt Jenna decided to sell the farmhouse and move closer to us in Portland, too shaken by the events to stay there alone. As we packed up the car to leave, I noticed how different the beautiful farmhouse looked to me now. The golden fields seemed less inviting, and the woods felt like they were hiding secrets. The forgotten road that led to the property now seemed ominous rather than charming. It's been 15 years since that summer, and I still can't sleep with my window uncovered. My parents never let me stay anywhere alone after that incident until I was 18, and I'm grateful for their protective nature, even if I didn't understand it then.